My brother stopped talking to me 3 years ago, and for 3 years I had no idea why. That sounds simple when I say it like that, but it wasn't simple at all, because Daniel wasn't just my brother, he was the person I had grown up with, the person who knew every version of me that had ever existed, and losing him to silence was one of the strangest and most disorienting things I have ever been through. We had been close our whole lives. Not in a way that required constant contact or daily phone calls, but in that deeper way that brothers sometimes are, where you can go weeks without talking and then pick up exactly where you left off, where you share a specific language of references and jokes and memories that nobody else has access to, where you just know that the other person is there. And then one day he wasn't there anymore. It started gradually, the way these things often do. He stopped responding to my messages as quickly as he used to, and I told myself he was busy, because he was always busy, he had a demanding job and a life that moved fast. Then he stopped responding altogether, and when I called he didn't pick up, and when I left voicemails he didn't call back, and after about 6 weeks of this I knew that something was wrong but I had no idea what it was. I went through everything I could think of. I replayed our last conversations, our last time together, looking for something I might have said or done that could explain it. I couldn't find anything. The last time I had seen him we had watched a football game at his place, eaten pizza, argued about nothing important the way we always did, and said goodbye at the door the same way we always said goodbye. Nothing had felt different. Nothing had felt wrong. I called my mother. She said she didn't know anything, that Daniel seemed fine when she spoke to him, that maybe I should give him some space. I called our cousin who was close to both of us. He said he hadn't noticed anything unusual. I even called our old friend Mark, who had known us both since we were teenagers, and Mark said he had no idea what I was talking about, that he had seen Daniel recently and he seemed perfectly fine. So I gave him space. And then more space. And then the space became months and the months became a year and then 2 years and then 3, and somewhere in the middle of all that waiting I went from confused to hurt to something quieter and more permanent, something that felt less like anger and more like grief, because that is what it is when someone who is still alive disappears from your life without explanation. I thought about reaching out 100 times. I drafted messages I never sent, picked up the phone and put it down again, drove past his apartment once and sat outside for 20 minutes before driving away without knocking. I didn't know what I would say. I didn't know if he would answer. And some part of me was afraid that whatever the reason was, hearing it out loud might make things worse rather than better. And then I ran into him at a petrol station on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and the choice was taken out of my hands entirely. He was filling his tank when I pulled in. I saw him before he saw me, and for a second I just sat in my car and looked at him through the windscreen, this person I had grown up with, standing 20 feet away from me after 3 years of silence, looking older than I remembered and tired in a way I recognized because I probably looked the same. He saw me when he put the nozzle back. He went very still for a moment, and then he nodded, just slightly, the way you nod at someone you know but aren't sure how to approach, and I got out of my car and walked over and said the only thing I could think of to say. I said, "Daniel. What happened to us?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him deciding something, working through something, and then he said, "You really don't know?" I said, "I really don't know. I have been trying to figure it out for 3 years." He looked away, across the petrol station forecourt, and then back at me, and he said, "Mark told me what you said about me. After Dad's birthday. He told me what you said when I wasn't in the room." I went very still. Dad's birthday had been 3.5 years ago, a family dinner at our parents' house, and Mark had been there because he had been coming to family dinners for years, so long that nobody questioned it anymore. I remembered the evening clearly enough. I remembered Daniel arriving late, I remembered the meal, I remembered afterwards when a few of us had stayed to help clean up. I said, "What did Mark tell you?" I said. Daniel looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something careful and guarded, like he was bracing himself. And then he told me. According to Mark, after Daniel had left the room that evening, I had said that Daniel was jealous of me, that he had always been jealous of me, that he was the kind of person who would never be happy with what he had because he was always looking at what everyone else had. According to Mark, I had said all of this in front of several people, casually, like it was something I believed completely and had no hesitation in saying. I stood there at the petrol station and I felt something cold move through me. Because here is the thing. The thing that made it complicated, the thing that made Mark's version so much harder to dismiss than a straightforward lie would have been. About a month before Dad's birthday, I had said something to Mark, just the two of us, in a private conversation, that touched on something related to this. I had said, carefully and in confidence, that I sometimes wondered if Daniel and I had a dynamic that was harder than it looked from the outside, that there were moments when I felt a tension between us that I couldn't always explain. I had said it once, privately, as a tentative and uncertain observation about something I wasn't even sure was real. Mark had taken that, and he had turned it into something specific and damning in public, and he had delivered it to my brother as a verdict rather than a wondering. I told Daniel all of this. I told him exactly what I had actually said, when I had said it, and to whom. I told him the difference between what I had actually said and what Mark had told him I said. And I watched his face as I talked, watched it move through disbelief and then something more complicated, that particular look of someone who is recalculating something they thought they understood. When I finished he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "I need to talk to Mark." I said, "So do I." We called Mark that same evening, both of us, together. Daniel called from his phone and I sat next to him in his car in the petrol station car park, and when Mark answered Daniel put him on speaker and said, "I'm here with my brother. And we need to talk about what you told me 3 years ago." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted long enough that I knew, before Mark said a single word, that everything Daniel had been told was exactly what I thought it was. Mark tried several things. He tried to say he didn't remember the conversation clearly. He tried to say that maybe he had misunderstood what I said and passed it on incorrectly. He tried to suggest that there was probably truth on both sides and that these things were always complicated. And with each attempt his voice got a little smaller and a little less certain, and Daniel beside me got a little quieter and a little stiller, and by the time Mark had finished talking there was nothing left to say to him that either of us wanted to say on a phone call. Daniel ended the call. He sat with his hands on the steering wheel and looked straight ahead through the windscreen, and I sat next to him and didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say in that particular silence. After a while he said, "I should have called you. At some point in 3 years, I should have just called you and asked." I said, "I should have pushed harder. I kept giving you space when I should have knocked on your door." He nodded slowly. And then he said, "I'm sorry." I said, "So am I." We sat in his car for another 20 minutes, talking about nothing particularly important, just finding our way back into the rhythm of two people who know each other well enough to be comfortable in each other's company, and it was awkward in places and easy in others and it felt like exactly what it was, which was a beginning rather than a continuation. Two people starting something over from a point further back than where they had left off. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, Daniel texted me an address. It was the basketball court where we had played as kids, the one 3 blocks from our parents' house, the one with the broken backboard on the left side that had been broken for as long as either of us could remember and had never once been repaired. I got there before him. I stood at the edge of the court and looked at it, at the cracked concrete and the bent hoop and the faded lines, and it looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood places always look smaller when you come back to them as an adult. Daniel arrived 7 minutes later with a basketball under his arm, and he looked at me and said, "You still got it?" I said, "I was always better than you and you know it." He laughed, and it was the first time I had heard him laugh in 3 years, and it sounded exactly the same as it always had, and then he bounced the ball to me and I caught it and we played, on that cracked concrete court with the broken backboard, for the better part of 2 hours, and neither of us mentioned Mark and neither of us mentioned the 3 years and neither of us needed to.